Ben, for agreeing to do this talk. It's my pleasure to introduce an old friend and colleague, Ben Eggleton, as the speaker in the Photonics Innovation Centre seminar series. I have to confess I've known Ben for about a quarter of a century now. We met at, I guess if I'm a host I can share my screen. So maybe I can share this. If you can see that. This is when I met Ben. We're standing at the back up here somewhere, looking much younger than we do now. That was taken in 1995 in New Hampshire at the Tilton Nonlinear Optics and Lasers meeting. So there's other famous people in this picture, so I'll leave it up for a moment and see who you recognize. But we've all got a bit older now. Anyway, I seem to remember trying to recruit Ben as a postdoc to come to Glasgow at that point, but he saw the light and decided not to. He went back to Sydney, I believe, to finish his PhD, then became a postdoc at Bell Labs Lucent, where he then stayed and became a permanent member of technical staff for a number of years. Until 2003, I trolled your LinkedIn account for this information. He went back to Australia, to the University of Sydney, where he's held multiple positions over the years, too many to mention, but he's currently the director of the Sydney Nano Institute and co-director of the New South Wales Smart Sensing Network. Prior to that, we have hosted him in Toronto when he's been director of the Kudos Centre at the University of Sydney. So he's exceptionally well known in the field of optics and photonics. Ben is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Sciences, the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, Optical Science Society of America, the IEEE, the SPIE, and he's currently editor-in-chief of the APL Photonics Journal, which is a great journal for us to put papers towards. So today he's going to give a presentation entitled A Renaissance in Brillouin Scattering. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ben Eggleton to University of Toronto, albeit virtually.
Thanks, Stuart. Great to be here. Great to be talking to this intimate audience, which is fantastic. So it's 8 a.m. in Sydney time. So what I'm going to do is the normal routine. I'm going to share my slides. Let's just see if that actually works. And I'm going to share computer sound because I actually have in my presentation a short video. Let's see if that's going to work. But I need to put this on. Are you seeing that screen?
I'm seeing your PowerPoint, but not as a...
Okay, so let me... How about that?
That looks good now.
That's good?
Yep.
Great, okay, well, fantastic. So I look forward to presenting over the next 45 minutes, interspersed with some questions, given that it's a small audience, an overview of research in my group on the topic of Brillouin scattering. The front slide contains a fascinating image of an F-18 Super Hornet as it breaks the speed of sound, which I love for a number of reasons, because it links light and sound, which is going to be a focus here, but it also links to one of the use cases for our research, which is in defense, and in particular, some of the work we're doing with the Air Force. So I'll come back to that. But let me dive right in, and as an introduction, just talk a little bit about where I am at in Sydney, Australia. I've been to Toronto many times, going back almost 25 years when I would hang out with John Sipe in January, February, and it was always in the middle of a blizzard. So, and then I've obviously visited many times and been hosted by Stuart and others. Sydney, beautiful campus. We are 170 years old, and we like to think of ourselves as the premier campus in Australia, but I think premier here really reflects the fact that we were the first university in Australia. And at the moment, interestingly enough, we're in a reasonably good position considering the COVID-19 financial crisis, which is creating lots of grief for other universities around Australia, particularly around international students that can't get into Australia. But we're pretty highly ranked. In fact, I think we're in a similar kind of stratosphere to Toronto in terms of our global rankings. So my own role these days spans across a number of leadership roles and research foci. As Stuart mentioned, my main gig is as director of Sydney Nano, which is one of the university's flagship multidisciplinary institutes. I'm going to exemplify that research with one particular example of work we've done, which I think will be of interest. I also co-direct a consortium of universities that's sponsored by the state government, and it's focused on smart sensors and translation into prosperity and working with partners. And then my own research these days is mostly sponsored by the Australian Air Force. And 2 years ago, I established the Jericho Smart Sensing Lab, which has a focus on smart sensors and sensor fusion. And we're doing work that is unclassified, but I'm unable to talk about most of that research because it's still confidential. But I will give an example of what we're working on. But there is an overarching theme that wraps through all of these projects, which is smart sensors. So sensors it has come of age, it's fair to say, and is having real impact in the health area, but also in safeguarding in the environment, in infrastructure, and many other areas. And I'll come back to that point. And I'll dive in more deeply, obviously. A little bit more about Sydney Nano. Actually, our main foci are in material science and life science, which is interesting given that the Institute started off with origins in quantum computing and photonics, but these days we are very multidisciplinary, and we do span across particularly life sciences, which isn't surprising if you consider that the Faculty of Medicine and Health is about 50% of the university. So a lot of really good engagement with clinicians across the broad university ecosystem. And as part of that initiative, I set up last year a new network on nano health. Just to pause very briefly. And there's a lot of photonics and optics that sits in here. But without going into too much detail, just to really sort of highlight the sort of meta structure for Sydney Nano, we've got these clusters and capability areas that are spread across a number of faculties, particularly science, engineering, medicine, and health. You'll see sensors and diagnostics, lab on a chip, nanoparticles, nanopharma, and we work closely with a number of key disease areas. Wouldn't surprise you that in 2020, we spent a lot of time working with the Infectious Disease Institute, but also with the vision, neurological disorders, cardiovascular. So that's been really exciting for me as a physicist to spend half of my time talking to medicos. I want to briefly just mention some of the work on sensors and diagnostics because I think it'll speak to the context. So one of our priorities in 2020 indeed was COVID-19, as you'd expect. And early in 2020, we started a strategy on next generation testing technology for virus or antibodies. And we brought together the whole university community ecosystem, science, engineering, medicine, clinicians, as well as healthcare professionals from hospitals. And through that initiative, we ran together with the Mary Bashir Institute for Infectious Disease a number of co-design workshops that led to a roadmap that was developed for COVID-19 sensor technology. And that was published earlier this year in Nature Biotechnology. So you can download that. And it's a really interesting document because it essentially is a roadmap and lays out priorities for sensor technology for COVID-19 and more generally for infectious disease. And the interesting theme that emerged here is that what this initiative pointed to was the requirement for a test that measures the transmissibility of the virus, which is a subtle point, but it makes the point that when you're infected, it's not a yes or a no. What matters is actually how infectious you are, and that depends somewhat on the biology, but it also depends on the physiology. And it's more important than ever in the context of a world that is rolling out a vaccine, because as we know, the vaccine doesn't necessarily mean you don't infect others. So Lots of interesting insights there. If you want a dumbed down version of this article, I did a Q&A that was captured in Optics and Photonics News. This was in January issue. So there's an interview there where I'm talking about this research priorities setting exercise to Optics Photonics News in a very basic sort of language. So that was just a little bit of a preamble to set the scene, but I want to now go back to the focus of the talk, which is very much on research from my group, and the topic of the presentation, which is Brillouin Scattering. So this is my team of scientists and engineers, and this is a photo taken in front of the Sydney Nanoscience Hub, where I'm sitting right now, and this was taken early in 2020, just after the bushfires and before we went into lockdown, because we had a window of about 3 weeks where we could go to the office and the sky wasn't red. So that's when this photo was taken. And we're supported by a number of agencies, including the Traditional Research Council, state government. But you'll see a theme running through this presentation that there's a lot of engagement with the defence end users, and that means the Air Force. It also means ONRG, or ONR in the US, and the Office of Scientific Research and the US Army Research Lab, but also some of the defence primes such as L3 and Lockheed Martin. I want to also note that I've had some fantastic students and postdocs in my group who are now in permanent positions. Birgit is a group leader in Erlangen, Irina is a senior lecturer at UTS, David is a professor in Twente, and Andrea is director of Silicon Photonics Research at Bell Labs, and my collaborators. So what we focus on in my group is fundamental and more applied research in photonic integration. So a couple of highlights to give you a flavor of what we've been working on in the last couple of years. This is work published in collaboration with Morty Segev for demonstration of topological protection of biphoton states. So by biphoton states, we refer to correlated photons. There was a follow-up publication demonstrating topological protection of entangled photons. This is in the silicon photonic circuit that's designed to provide topological protection. We've been working with Dawn Tan at the Singapore University of Design Technology on silicon-rich nitride. This is a really interesting nonlinear material that has the high nonlinearity of silicon without the two-photon absorption and free carriers, and that allowed us to report a demonstration of break solitons, a topic that Stuart and John Sipe would be familiar with. But here we essentially reproduced experiments that I reported 25 years ago in an optical fiber, but in a ultra compact Bragg rating that was written into a silicon-rich nitride photonic chip using electron beam lithography. And interestingly enough, the actual soliton dynamics very much replicated those original experiments. So there's interesting fundamental limits there. And finally, the focus of the presentation today, which is going to be on Brillouin photonics. So photonic chips certainly has been the focus of my team for over a decade. And what's sort of interesting here is that initially photonic chips were really developed in the context of the communications backbone. So they were designed and utilized to provide energy efficient bandwidth, data centers, long haul, and that was the narrative. And what we've seen over the last 10 years in my research and more generally is a broadening of the application space for photonic chips into, for example, microwave communications, and I'll be giving you some examples of that. Certainly quantum technology, and it's fair to say that there are a number of very successful startup companies, SMEs in Australia, in the US, in Canada, noting the very nice work that I think a number of you are probably associated with the company in Toronto, whose name escapes me right now, but also the work in California from Jeremy O'Brien's company that utilizes silicon photonics and other integrated photonic technologies for quantum processing, and then of course sensing devices, whether it relates to healthcare, environmental monitoring, LiDAR, radar. And of course, to a large extent, we're leveraging the massive investment that's gone into silicon technology and more specifically silicon photonics over the last 40 years, and it's worth noting that in your iPhone, and I have the iPhone 12, the feature sizes of the logic gates are 5 nanometers, which is extraordinary. So already there's nanotechnology in your smartphone, and that is providing that breathtaking processing power, edge processing, if you like, in your hand. And the agenda here is to leverage as much as possible the investment that's gone into silicon. And of course, in the US, there's been investment from the federal government in the form of AIM Photonics, which is a consortium of universities and government agencies and industry working together on integrated photonics. And there are foundries around the world that we can access. So we work very closely with IMEC in Belgium, where they have a multi-wafer process that allows us to fabricate advanced silicon photonics. IBM had for many years a very sophisticated foundry that's been outsourced, and now, of course, in Sydney we have our own capability that's up and running, and it's very sophisticated and impressive. And it's also worth noting that what makes this vision really compelling is that, as well as having a passive silicon photonic fabric that is the basis of passive functions, we know that we can also integrate onto a silicon chip using flip chip bonding, hybrid integration lasers. And there's been a lot of good work from a number of groups around the world that incorporate 3.5s, quantum dot lasers onto silicon chips. We also know that we can integrate modulators into silicon, and that's CMOS compatible. And the performance of these modulators is improving all the time. And we also know that we can implant germanium detectors into silicon in a CMOS compatible way. So really the narrative here is that the photonic chip day has come in that we have now a complete CMOS compatible, or at least almost CMOS compatible, a photonic integration platform that can be scaled. And that's going to be the basis of the work that we're focusing on here. But we're going to talk about nonlinear optics. And just to remind you, of course, when we describe optical nonlinearity, we refer to this Taylor expansion, where each term in that Taylor expansion represents a particular nonlinearity. The chi2 is the electro-optic effect, or associated with the electro-optic effect that we're all familiar with. And in this work, we're focusing on the third order nonlinearities that are the dominant nonlinearities in amorphous materials, such as silica and the trichogenites, and also silicon. Even though it's a crystalline material, the dominant nonlinearity there is the chi3 nonlinearity. And that manifests in the intensity dependent refractive index, which we're all familiar with. And of course, it's worth remembering that the relevant parameter here is the gamma, which is into an effective area. So really the challenge statement is to maximize the nonlinearity by developing materials that have very high nonlinearity and very small mode effective area. And then there are, of course, many well-known nonlinear effects that have been studied extensively over the last 30, 40 years in my group, and Stuart's group, and John's group. And we're going to focus today really on that Brillouin effect. Just a bit of history. Of course, nonlinear optics is a relatively new field, arguably. It was a discovery back in 1961 in Ann Arbor. I've actually stood in front of the building on the campus there where the experiment was performed, and there's a little plaque. I was with Herb Winful. There's a little plaque that celebrates the fact that these gentlemen back in 1961 observed frequency doubling of light, and that was published. And of course, there's a great story about the fact that the copy editor deleted the relevant data point on the plot because he or she thought it was just an inaccuracy or a blemish. So the published paper doesn't actually have the second harmonic. The Kerr effect was discovered in the 70s with the development of optical fibers. Roger Stolen and Chin-Lun Lin, who I believe are both living, and I've seen Chin-Lun, I think 3 or 4 years ago. I haven't seen Roger for a while. And of course, Raman was observed a short time after. Eric Ippen, who was just announced as an honorary member of the Optical Society. And I think I saw Eric a few years ago. And then finally, SBS in also 1970s by Ippen and Stolen. It's a great story there. I remember being at MIT about 3 years ago and giving this presentation, and Eric was sitting in the front row and sharp as ever. And it's really humbling to sort of reflect on the fact that his early work was published when I was only a few years old. Right, so we're going to focus on bringing SBS onto a chip. This is an artist's impression. And so somehow you can see the idea is to bring a nonlinear medium into a chip that also incorporates the active and passive components. And to the extent that it's possible, utilizing that CMOS process that I referred to, so that we can leverage all of the investment that's gone into CMOS over the last 20 years. And this is from a review article that I wrote with colleagues of mine that appeared in 2019. Now, the context for much of our research is in microwave photonics. So I want to spend a little bit of time just setting the scene by explaining what microwave photonics is. So basically, this is manipulating RF signals using photonic techniques. That's a pretty straightforward concept. And it's a reasonably well-established concept. It's been around for 30 years, and in fact has been deployed in a number of applications, particularly radio over fiber and antenna remoting. We're focusing in this presentation on signal processing. So we're going to use photonics to manipulate RF signals as part of a processing function. So that will focus on filtering, phase shifting, beam forming. There's also signal generation, which we've looked at. I won't be talking about that in this presentation. And the overall advantage is that you get the benefit of the bandwidth associated with utilizing photonics, the low loss, although there's some challenges with the RF link performance that I'll come back to. In defense applications, you have the immunity to electromagnetic interference because you aren't relying on any high-speed digital components, and these signal processing functions are reconfigurable, so programmable. So that's a very attractive proposition for many of the applications. So if we look at the canonical microwave photonic link, which is summarized in this simple diagram. So the idea here is that the RF antenna is picking up the RF analog waveform. That could be a radar signal. It could be in the context of picking up an analog signal from space. And that analog signal that is oscillating at tens of gigahertz is then transmitted through an RF link, and it will be transduced onto an optical carrier using an electro-optic interface. Now, what is that electro-optic interface? It is essentially an electro-optic modulator. So this would be a commercially available electro-optic modulator based on lithium niobate, so that the RF signal is now transduced into the optical domain. So the RF signal sits in the sidebands of the optical carrier, which is typically going to be configured for 1.5 micron. And now the photonic signal processing is performed in the optical domain, and that could be filtering, phase, other functionalities. And then, of course, at the other end of the link, we use an O to E interface to transduce back into the RF domain. And so we're going to focus on filtering as an example later on in the presentation, simply because it's the easiest one to grasp. And it's a really important building block for all RF systems. And it turns out a filter is also the basis of many important functionalities. So we will focus on this later on. So this schematic just illustrates the basic idea of removing an unwanted signal that could be a jammer by placing a notch filter right near the signal of interest without affecting the signal of interest and removing that jamming signal. And again, so the benefits are the tunability over tens of gigahertz. You're only limited by the bandwidth of your modulator and your detector, and in principle, they can go out to 100 gigahertz and beyond. And that immunity that I talked about, and the possibility for integration. So the basic concept of RF photonics is as old as almost I am, but for many decades, it really was solution looking for a problem, and all of the demonstrations sat on the top of tabletop benchtops and lack the integration to make them really compelling for applications. But the advent of photonic integration now makes this really a very attractive proposition for many, many use cases, as I will explain. So there's been a lot of good research over decades. As mentioned, it's worth noting that early demonstrations, even in the 80s, started to foreshadow the possibility of utilizing integrated optics for processing microwave signals. But it's fair to say that most of the action has happened in the last 10 years, and there are many groups around the world doing really impressive research on integrated microwave photonics in different platforms, indium phosphide, indium gallium phosphide, and HIDEX, of course. It wouldn't surprise you to see HIDEX is revealed silicon nitride platforms. Some of this very nice work from Jose Capmany and Arthur Lowry's group on these multi-purpose silicon processors are very attractive. And really, each platform has its own advantage, disadvantage, limitations. And what I'm going to focus on is really a kind of unique approach that we think sits in a sweet spot that has the benefit of being optically programmable, and associated with the Brillouin response provides a very ultra-high selective response that's really important for the applications that we focus on. So let me continue on with this journey. So when we dive in to this topic, we have to start with the important note that there are three key priorities to consider when we look at integrated microwave photonics. There is the functionality. So functionality refers to filtering or phase shifting or sensing. And with Brillouin-based processing, it's going to be the ability to achieve very high resolution filtering. It's really important that we maintain performance. Most of the demonstrations that I just alluded to fail to report link performance, and that's a bit like doing a systems experiment for a digital signal without doing the bit error rate measurement. And really, many of the approaches that have been reported are far from the level of link performance that's required, and really has to put it in the context of the spurious free dynamic range link gain noise figure. And of course, the integration brings that size, weight, power benefit. So these are recent articles from my group that start to flesh out the roadmap and the design rules, particularly the figures of merit around performance requirements that are needed in the context of integrated Brillouin-based photonic chips. So let's look a little bit at the physics, and just to remind you that when we talk about stimulated Brillouin scattering, we're talking about hypersound. So, of course, with hypersound, we invoke the concept of a phonon, but I want to be very clear that when I refer to phonon, this is a completely classical effect. I'm not invoking any quantum mechanical effects here. And of course, the phonon is the sound wave analog to the photon of light. But the key concept here is that these sound waves that are associated with this particular Brillouin interaction are hypersonic in that they have a frequency of gigahertz. And what's interesting with gigahertz phonons is that if you do the back of the envelope calculation, noting that the speed of sound in these solid state materials is going to be thousands of meters per second. So it's going to be typically 10 times the speed of sound at sea level on the planet Earth. The wavelength of the phonon is roughly equal to the wavelength of the light wave. So we're in this sort of intriguing regime where the sound waves and the light waves are have similar wavelengths, so that they can be manipulated by the same waveguide structure. But it turns out, as I will explain, to be a non-trivial exercise. So really what we've been doing in my team for the last 5 years is controlling and harnessing these hypersonic waves in symphony with light and interfacing these signal processing functions with electrons and electronics. And this is a cartoon of a sound wave propagating along a wire. And you can see that the wavelength is roughly equivalent to the wavelength of light, or roughly equivalent to the dimensions of the RIB waveguide. And we can then integrate these circuits into these CMOS compatible chips. And of course, the point is that the photonics bridges microwaves and optical waves, and I'll explain and expand on that. So what are we doing? Well, we focus on stimulated Brillouin scattering. There is some really exquisite physics involved that I don't have time to go into. It turns out in the sub-wavelength scale limit that the electrorestriction picture that we're familiar with that applies to optical fibers is more sophisticated, and we have to take into account the radiation pressure on the boundaries of these waveguides, and so more complete formal pictures are required. And some of my very bright theorist colleagues have developed Hamiltonian descriptions that describe these interactions. So there's a lot of modeling involved, and some new theoretical frameworks that my colleagues have had to develop. We have to understand the optical and acoustic properties of these materials at these very high acoustic frequencies, and design devices and fabricate devices that have these new properties. And ultimately, we're interested in on-chip SBS and its application, so that goes without saying, and we want to be compatible with CMOS. So to the extent that it's possible, we're going to leverage silicon to create functionalized SBS circuits. So of course, CMOS stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor, but as Tingy Lee used to say, it really is simply cheap because it's made of silicon, and that's the advantage of marriage with silicon. So let's just remind ourselves the simple physics picture with SBS. So SBS is a nonlinear interaction of a pump wave with an acoustic wave, the hypersonic sound wave, that generates backscattered Stokes wave at a different frequency, a frequency offset from the pump. So let's try to understand this interaction through a very simple toy model here. So we imagine a light wave at omega 1 propagating through this waveguide from the left to the right, and in the medium it's propagating at C on N. If we were to inject another light wave at exactly the same frequency, those two light waves would interfere to form a standing wave. And that standing wave, it turns out, would induce in the medium through electrorestriction the light pressure at the atomic scale, a grating, a Bragg grating that would actually reflect light at that exact frequency, and so through the elasto-optic effect. So that's sort of an interesting example, not a particularly useful one. So let's slightly change the configuration, and now imagine that the counter-propagating light wave is at a slightly different frequency. So now you've got pump 1, pump 2 at a slightly different frequency, and it turns out, of course, they still will interfere to form a beat pattern. We don't call it a standing wave because the beat pattern now that's formed actually moves through the medium. It moves through the medium at a speed determined by the frequency offset. When the two frequencies are exactly the same, the beat pattern is a standing wave. But as you slightly offset the counter-propagating wave, you find that the beat pattern starts to increase in speed, and it gets faster and faster and faster until at a very specific frequency offset where the beat pattern moves at the speed of sound. And it's at that very specific frequency offset, which happens to be about 10, 20 gigahertz, that the beat pattern that's generated by the interference of these counter-propagating waves perfectly matches the speed of sound. And then that exact frequency, you get a phase-matched coupling between the counter-propagating live waves, the generated acoustic wave, and you get very strong back reflection at a frequency that's offset because of the Doppler shift associated with the movement of that beat pattern. So the net result is that SBS manifests in a very narrow band frequency response at these very specific frequency offsets, the Stokes shift and the anti-Stokes, where that frequency offset is determined by the speed of sound. And it's dependent on the pump power. And the line width is actually determined by the photon lifetime. So the photon lifetime at room temperature is about 9 nanoseconds. So you end up with this very exquisite, roughly 20 megahertz Lorentzian-shaped filter function, roughly 11 gigahertz offset from the pump. And normally this is a nuisance, but I'll show you, and as we've demonstrated, this is a very desirable filter function that is perfectly matched to applications in microwave processing. So just to summarize that narrative, the pump induces at a frequency shift of about 10 gigahertz, a gain line width of about 30 megahertz for counterpropagating waves, and that gain can be many tens of dB, and it's a very powerful filter function, particularly for signal processing. And so if we put that filter function in the context of microwave photonics, which is the idea that we can use that filter to manipulate a microwave signal, and this is a figure taken from a review article that we published last year in Advances in Optics and Photonics, and it really compares to other microwave filter technologies. And you'll see that the SBS filter has this very exquisite spectral resolution that is almost unmatched by other technologies. Now, there are other technologies that exist out there that have high resolution that are based simply on RF components, but they won't have the bandwidth or the agility or the reconfigurability. So it really is in a sweet spot and therefore very powerful for microwave photonics applications. Okay, and of course we sit on the shoulders of giants. It's worth noting that in 2022, we'll be celebrating 100 years since Brillouin first proposed this effect. With my colleagues, we're putting together a book on the topic of Brillouin scattering. The working title is 100 Years of BS. And we've got many of the top researchers from around the world, and that will be published next year. So stay tuned for that. But of course, over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a bit of a renaissance with stimulated Brillouin scattering, in that nanophotonics and integrated optics has really allowed for the first time some really impressive breakthroughs that I'll explain and expand on from our group and from many groups around the world. And the field is just taking off. You can see the history over the last 40 years since that first demonstration of SBS, and many of the seminal demonstrations in the 90s, and our demonstration in 2010 was the first on chip, and we've just seen a lot of great progress over the last 10 years with many groups, and that's taking off. And there's a workshop now that's held every 2 years. This is the first workshop in Sydney in 2015, workshop in optomechanics and Brillouin scattering. It was held in Besançon 2017, Israel in 2019, and it was supposed to be in Erlangen this year, the week after Clio Europe. But my understanding is it will be a virtual meeting, and it will likely go ahead in 2022. Hopefully when the vaccines are being bedded down around the world. So the nice thing about Brillouin-based technology is that you can build a prototype based on off-the-shelf components. So this is a prototype we built a number of years ago for the US Army Research Lab, and it uses optical fiber components. And so you can put that together and you can assemble that, and it's reasonably robust and portable, and you can take that to a lab anywhere in the world. Of course, that's interesting, but what's really exciting, and why many of our partners are sponsoring us, is that they want to see this integrated onto a chip. And I want to wrap up this presentation by just giving a bit of a perspective on kind of the state of the art and where are the challenges. How do we bring this solution, which was demonstrated initially on a benchtop, can be put together based on off-the-shelf components into a prototype the size of a laptop, and ultimately can be brought onto a chip and integrated into a device the size of my smartwatch. So there are some challenges. It turns out, as already hinted at, the theory isn't straightforward. Optical forces are complicated. The waveguides themselves have to be reimagined. What works for light doesn't always work for sound. And the materials are inherently not particularly optoacoustic. Silica is desirably not very optoacoustic at all. And we have to really reimagine the design of the entire circuit. If we look at Boyd's book, we see that the Brillouin coefficient depends, interestingly enough, on the refractive index to the power of 8. So that's a clue, isn't it? So we need a material with a high index, but we also need a small mode area, goes without saying, and we need low loss. And I guess the key here is we also need good optoacoustic overlap. So we need a regime where the acoustic mode is guided in a core in which the speed of sound is in fact lower than the speed of sound in the cladding. And in general, that tends to be not compatible with traditional integrated optics. So the Trichogenite glasses, which my group has been working on almost for 20 years, somehow serendipitously have unique properties. So here the core speed of sound is 2,600 meters per second, and the silica speed is found over 6,000 meters per second. So we have very strong optical confinement, and we have very strong acoustic confinement. And that's the basis of the very strong stimulated Brillouin scattering. We have very low loss, we have very small mode area. And so typically we are in a regime where we are accessing thousands of times more Brillouin gain than silica, in some cases 100,000 times. And so that was first reported in 2011, 10 years ago. And we've seen enormous progress, and I'll just skip through this very quickly. As we have progressed the platform, Blair Morrison was my student. He's now in Toronto, working for the quantum tech startup company. Blair did some great work on hybrid integration, integrating into silicon. I'll say a little bit more about that. And so really, in summary, that platform now is quite robust. We routinely achieve 40 dB, 50 dB of gain onto these platforms, and we are now integrating the Trichogenite glass into silicon-based chips fabricated in IMEC. That provides access to more sophisticated components. So this is Blair and Alvaro who led this work that was published a few years ago. And the basic idea is that the Trichogenite glass has been deposited onto the chip. We do the etching, and we have very low loss interface into the waveguide, and that works very well. And you can have a closer look at that micrograph here. So you can see this is about a 1 millimeter squared footprint, where we have a couple of centimeters of SBS waveguide with about 25, 30 dB of gain, which is quite remarkable. And that's been a real powerhouse for the group. We can integrate this with other functions. So this is work Yang Lao and others reported last year, where we bring the Brillouin processor together with ring resonators. So you can see that more sophisticated circuit here, combining ring resonators and SBS waveguides, and that yields improved performance. So I think I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of interesting and a bit of a narrative. So this has been a platform across my team with a number of different foci. So in microwave, also Brillouin sensing, frequency combs, microwave source, light storage, and more recently carrier recovery and coherent communication systems. But I want to just sort of end the talk by just talking very briefly about the radio frequency environment, because that's the big one. And this sort of links into some of these defense applications where you're really dealing with this very complicated, cluttered electromagnetic environment. There's a big focus here, and I think in the US as well, and Canada, I'm sure, in space, and there's just growing need for agile, reconfigurable broadband RF components that can process over tens of gigahertz in many different contexts, whether they're civilian or in the context of cyber, space, or defense. And of course, just to remind you, the basic architecture here is to use that electro-optic modulator to transduce the RF signal into the sideband. So this is actually just reminding you that the optical carrier is at 193 terahertz, and that RF carrier sits in the sideband, and here we use the photonic processing module to do that processing. So we've been working on this for a number of years, and in fact, as part of this work, my team won a national award last year. So this was the Eureka Prize presented by the minister. It was a virtual ceremony. This is my team, and we're sitting in a lecture theatre in the City Nanoscience Hub with about 30 people, socially separated, isolated, and the minister is speaking to us through a virtual platform. This is a little movie. Let's see if this runs, and you could hear it.
Our team is harnessing the interaction between light and sound, called the Brillouin effect,
in a microchip to provide unique advantages for defense platforms. This compact technology heralds a new era in microwave signal processing as the basis of a frequency agile and reconfigurable microwave system. We've developed prototypes for Lockheed Martin, L3 Harris, US Army Research, DSTG and RAF, and these prototypes show real gains in performance, efficiency and cost. I assume you could hear that?
Yes, we can.
Good, okay. So, and then finally the Jericho Smart Sensing Lab, and this is me standing with some group captains and air commodores. The gentleman standing next to me is a 1-star, and over here we've got Paul Scully-Power, who's Australia's first astronaut, and Duncan Iverson, who is our Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research, and I'm pointing at a chip, which is the kind of iconic thing to do. I think I'm going to probably wrap up here because I see we've got about 10 minutes, and I propose to wrap up here, Stuart, if that's okay, and allow time for some questions.
That's certainly okay. I'm not sure if Professor Aitchison, Stuart, are you still?
Yeah,
yes.
no, I'm still here.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I was speaking on mute.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you want to host the question and answer?
No, because I have to go and set up on a different computer for my class just after 5. So
okay.
I listened into the talk, but if you could host the Q&A, that would be good.
Okay. John. Hi. So first of all, I'm representing everyone to give a big applause to the really exciting talk on Brillouin scattering on a chip. And it also, it's so clear also on the fundamental level as well. Thank you very much, Ben. So I'm opening up the floor for questions. Yes.
Do we just speak up, or do you want us to?
No, go ahead, John. Just go ahead.
Hi, Ben.
G'day, John. How you going?
Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Quick question. I mean, there's a lot of interest, of course, in non-classical states of light in the visible range, and there's a lot of interest in non-classical states in the microwave. So what's going on with sort of Brillouin scattering? You know, can you move non-classicality back and forth from, you know?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we've had that on our radar for many years. So we actually have at the moment in my lab a cryo facility that takes down to 1 Kelvin. Mm-hmm. And we had an honours student last year who did some work at 1 Kelvin, which is really difficult. And so the question we're asking then is, well, can we characterize Brillouin's frequency shifting at low temperature where there are less thermal phonons? Mm-hmm. And it turns out there's actually some literature on that that's been published decades back. And more recently, Peter Rakich has worked at that. And it turns out SBS at low temperatures is really complicated.
I see. Huh.
And it's there. And as someone who I think of very highly said, it's a can of worms. Uh-huh. And so I can follow up with you, but it's an interesting question. And indeed, I don't have a good answer, really. I think it's still worth exploring. So on the one hand, cryogenic SBS is complicated. There are some really subtle solid state effects that occur. At the same time, the more general statement around single photon sort of Brillouin, quantum state transducing using Brillouin is an interesting one and an open question.
Okay, interesting. Yep. Is that work that you mentioned, the cryo stuff, has that been published or?
No.
Okay.
No. That's very much at the beginning of the journey. Peter Rakich has published some work on it.
Oh, okay.
So if you Google, I mean, I can follow up with you, but I'm pretty sure Peter published a paper a year or two ago looking at cryogenic aspects of SBS. I don't think he was looking specifically at the question you're asking.
Right. Okay. But interesting. Yeah.
Yep.
And you think the cryo would have to go with cryo if you were going to go into the non-classical regime?
Well, I just think there are too many phonons. I mean, too much noise. I mean, it's sort of a noisy. And one of the issues that, you know, if I had 10 more minutes in my presentation, I would have talked about some of the issues that are limiting or challenging in terms of deploying these signal processing systems. And it is the noise figure. Okay. And it's the noise figure associated with spontaneous Brillouin and thermal phonons that introduce a noise.
Yeah, okay.
And it's not enormous, but it's there, and it's because you're dealing with thermal phonons.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Yep, excellent. Cheers. Good to see you still wearing the tie.
Yep.
Thank you. Let me remind everyone.
It's a dirty job, Ben, but somebody's got to do it.
And you, it's you. Yeah, fair enough.
Hi. Let me remind everyone to, if you have questions, you can type into the chat. I also have a question. Now, you showed that your Brillouin scattering has the narrow band, which is really great for microwave filtering. Now, it's limited to about 30 tens of megahertz. Is there a need, and is there a way to make that bandwidth much narrower?
Good question. So you can make it broader because the gain profile depends on the pump profile. So indeed, as you can with Raman, you can broaden out the gain quite easily. And we do that routinely. Mm-hmm. So we might, in fact, more generally, you can shape the gain profile. Mm-hmm. So work we've done and published with Lockheed Martin is on creating multiple bandpass filters, multiple notch filters, and having the ability to stretch the filter from 20, 30 megahertz out to 500 megahertz. And narrowing the filter is possible but difficult. It's fair to say that the intrinsic line width is determined by the phonon lifetime, which is temperature dependent. One of the questions, John, we are exploring at low temperatures is what happens to the phonon lifetime and what happens to the line width. And that's all really complicated. That doesn't do what you expect it to do. And then you can play some interesting games with sort of EIT-like EIT analogs, mm-hmm. where you can make the line width narrower basically through interference effects. And so we published, I think, a report on a 10 megahertz line width, and I think in principle you can go down to a few megahertz, but it comes at the expense of something else.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Neil. Neil, do you want to go ahead, or should I read the question?
I can answer that. It's a good question. Yeah, so the high gain, typically 100 milliwatt pump power. And so that, I would call that a hero result. It's not the regime we want to operate in. So we'd like to operate in a regime where the pump powers are more modest. But certainly, as you would expect in a university group, you're always going to push these samples to the limit. And the limit is typically 50 dB, and that's 100 milliwatts or so.
Okay. So in that case, do you worry about the pump depletion that takes place in that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So you would have to account for pump depletion. And more generally, you have to account for pump depletion in the systems. But usually it's not, I mean, as you're hinting at, usually it's not a concern in the regime that we're operating at.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I have another question, if I may. Polarization dependence, is this something that you worry about in these microwave photonic applications?
Yeah, typically we are controlling the polarization. So our devices might be single polarization state, but the waveguides themselves typically have some biorefrigerants. There's ongoing work to create waveguides that are low biorefrigerants. And some of the work that isn't published yet in my team, but was a Clio paper last year on polarization pulling. Right. We reported polarization pulling, SBS polarization pulling. Yeah. I think it was a Clio paper. Mm-hmm. It really requires very low biorefrigerants. And that's hard to do in an integrated waveguide geometry.
I see.
So there's ongoing work there. In one of our prototypes, we've got some polarization stabilization that we need to do associated with drift in the fiber. But that's probably addressing a different issue because that won't manifest in a waveguide chip. Yeah.
I see. So in general, in these applications, you do not want polarization dependence? Or is it,
in general, you're right, except for this funny polarization pulling example, which is sort of a bit of a sideline project. Mm-hmm. Generally, we don't want polarization dependence.
I see. Okay. But you can, of course, make use of it using this
Yes.
polarization polling effect.
Yes, yes.
Okay, it's interesting. Well, anybody else? All right. Well, in that case, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I know you also have a lecture to go to, right? A meeting to go to, so I don't want to prolong the time here. Thank you so much. We really have learned a lot, and I actually like to follow up with you, if I may, after about the Brillouin scattering, because we're doing some recent work on that. And able to create a very much narrow bandwidth. So
yeah, no, brilliant. Yeah, love to talk, love to collaborate.
Okay.
Absolutely. Hope one day that we can see each other in person.
Yes.
Hasn't it been just bizarre? I mean, all this Zooming and.
We would love to, invite you over here, take you to. Well, you've been here many times, but still, we still love to have you actually here in person if when the situation allows. All
Very
right.
good.
Thank you so much. Again,
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, John. Good on you. Thanks, Lee. Good on you, everyone. See you. Stay safe. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.